Hey everybody! Welcome to Your Nonsense, a podcast featuring stories about relationships, sex, pleasure, and everything human. I'm your host, Todd Barretts, a sex and relationship therapist in New York City. Together, we will have an ongoing conversation focusing on the unlimited spectrum of nonsense that accompanies our lives. Join me and some of my favorite people for some casual but meaningful fun. Hey everybody, today we have Sam. Sam is the artist behind the sex and relationship education accounts Shrimp Teeth and Cauliflower Hour. If you're not following, you should. They are super cool. When Sam is not creating great art for these accounts, she is a peer support specialist and advocate to folks dealing with a range of different issues from ethical non-monogamy to sexuality. So thank you, Sam, and welcome to this podcast. I really appreciate you spending some time with me.
Thank you for having me, Todd. I'm really happy we're connecting in person, well, over the phone, I guess.
Sort of in person. Me too.
Sort of.
So there's a bunch that I want to get to. So let's just start. First, just tell me and everybody else a little bit how you got into the space of sex, relationship, education, that whole space thing.
Yeah, so it's actually kind of a different story from most people that occupy this space. My background is actually working in advertising. So I was in New York working as a packaging designer, and I studied consumer psychology, did grad school. And then I got kind of tired of working in corporate advertising and moved cross country. And at that point, I started this account just because it was something I was really passionate about. I was working part-time, had a little bit of free time on my hands, and I just started to think a lot more about sex, relationship, education, and I've kind of filtered it through a consumer lens. So I know it's kind of different from the way that like you have formal training and education as a sex therapist. Where I come from is a lot more from the consumer lens. So I look a lot at like personal preference and how I can empower people to pretty much choose what they like, and sort of under this idea that there's not really a right or a wrong choice of how you want to engage in your relationship and sexuality, as long as it's supportive of your individual personalities, but also that it's, safe, sane, consensual, and all that good stuff.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, yes, we have different backgrounds, but the content and the process that we are engaging with is so similar.
Absolutely.
And I love what you're doing. Was there anything in your personal life that you were like, I want to start this account about sex and relationships, like in terms of maybe the therapy that you have had or haven't had, or education that you wish you had, that you're like, I'm doing this. This is something that's important to me.
Yeah, so it was actually kind of a culmination of things. Like I told you, I was finishing up grad school in consumer psychology, realizing like, maybe this isn't exactly the type of work that I want to be doing long term. And I was dabbling in art therapy and starting to figure out how I could get licensed. And
Ooh,
at
tell me
that
about
time,
dabbling in
yeah.
art therapy.
Okay, so I was at NYU going through their consumer psychology master's degree program, and I kind of was like, this is fascinating. I love what I'm studying. I don't like the practical applications of it. Not a huge fan of continuing to sell people products that they don't necessarily want or need. It was getting a little exhausting, honestly. So I ended up taking most of my other classes in art therapy, because that's a really awesome part of NYU. They let us do a lot of crossover classes.
That's so
Um,
cool.
yeah, and I really liked it. So what I actually do now as my job, I do healing art with children that are facing medical challenges with a nonprofit, and
Wow.
it's kind of a wonderful, yeah, it's a wonderful job. But like I told you, it was kind of a part-time thing. And again, moving away from New York, I felt like suddenly I had all this time to reevaluate the way that I was approaching my relationships, my queerness, all of it in New York, I felt like I'd been under so much stress and so focused on my career, on my education, that I didn't necessarily have time to step back and address that other part of my life. And suddenly it became a lot more apparent that this was becoming kind of a pressing thing. Again, it's something that my friends knew I was queer, but I never really talked about publicly. At work, most people didn't know I was gay, and just like understanding what that meant for me was sort of what started off Shrimp Teeth. I just started to talk about it a lot more as I started thinking about it for myself. And similarly, the non-monogamy part of it is that, I've had a long-term partner for almost 10 years now, and we'd on and off been seeing other people, but it was kind of I don't know how to say this without sounding really gross, but it was kind of a don't ask, don't tell thing, right? We didn't know what polyamory was, didn't have the language of non-monogamy.
I mean,
So we would,
it's not gross. It's actually pretty common. I think most of the
yeah,
couples, especially the cis gay men that I see, that is their policy. So it's not gross. It's just super common.
yeah, I guess I meant gross in the fact that it wasn't super empowering, right? It felt
Yeah.
like we were constantly having to hide the other people in our lives that were important to us, or diminish our relationships with them. And that's not a way that I personally enjoy treating other people. I think that it can wear on relationships. And I think for a lot of the people that we were seeing at the time, it did. And finally having the language to be able to say like, oh, we're non-monogamous, like there's a way to do this, there's a way to structure this, and to talk about it and make sure that everyone is on board, and sort of working through that process together. I noticed that a lot of other people had the same question. So what I tell people a lot is like, I'm not a guru. I don't know anything about non-monogamy. Don't look at me to find the answers. If anything, I've just made a ton of mistakes, and that's sort of where I'm at, right? I share the things, the common pitfalls that I've seen, and the ways that I go about problem solving, I think is sort of the way that I approach kind of sex education, relationship education in general.
Yeah, well, I think that the other thing is people always ask me that too, and I'm like, yeah, I'm not like some guru, but I think it gets to a point where you actually are. Like, so the work that you're doing, I don't like the word guru in general,
Right.
but you are becoming you are an expert in terms of the information that you're providing. It's spot on. So I think you might start embracing that term.
Well, thank you. But I think, yeah, if anything, I do really see myself as a guru in mistakes. Like a lot of what I do in terms of peer support is just share a lot of that, right? I think, when we're kind of in fringe relationship styles, depending on what community you're in, a lot of people don't know others that are non-monogamous, or at least not in a open way. So it can feel like everyone is just failing by themselves, right? And what I do is I talk to a lot of people about how, like, no, oh, you've made that mistake, I've made it too. You feel like you don't know what you're doing, same with me, right? And I think, again, that's where my background in branding kind of comes back in, is just like figuring out how to like approach problem solving and structure like relationships to fit individual preferences.
That's so cool. Yeah, I've also started to incorporate some of my own experiences into the work that I do, which is very
Mm-hmm.
like, I hate the word taboo, but it's very taboo for therapists to self-disclose and all of these obnoxious boundaries. It's not to say that I'm talking about my mother through in a session,
Sure.
but it's to say that a lot of these issues that many people deal with in relationships, they're operating under the assumption that they are struggling with these challenges in a vacuum, so in isolation, and nobody else is dealing with them. But as you're saying, that so many people are dealing with them, with some of these issues related to monogamy, non-monogamy, etc., and they're doing it alone. So again, I think some of the things that you're providing is and I think I am too, as well as a roadmap to, one, to
Mm-hmm.
feel less alone in some of this struggle, but two, to get some actual real information about how to do it. Because as you were saying, most people are operating around the don't ask, don't tell policy, or just kind of no policy at all.
Mhm.
But so now I think more and more, especially with Instagram, there's so much access to information and really good resources. That's helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's where I sort of fit between like your role as a formal therapist. I'm someone who has compiled a lot of these resources as well as like a list of queer and ethical monogamy friendly therapists. And I do point people to that, right? I make it pretty clear in my peer support sessions that I'm not here to provide therapeutic support. I'm not here to fix problems. I'm not here to diagnose anything, and that I just don't have that capacity. It's not within the scope of my work. So I do make it pretty clear that way. And what I do is, yeah, like provide a ton of reading materials that people might just not necessarily know or have the time to go find it, right? If you're starting off in non-monogamy, it can be super overwhelming. I remember, again, just like feeling like, okay, I've been, I don't like the word cheating because, again, it seems very taboo, but I've been operating under this like don't ask, don't tell, kind of seeing other people but not talking about it. And now all of a sudden I'm trying to formalize my relationship in a way that is much more like polyamorous. Where do you begin? It's kind of overwhelming. At least in my life, I didn't have any sort of role models or people who I could point to that had polyamorous and certainly not queer polyamorous relationships that were working. So a lot of it is just figuring out how to do this kind of DIY style. And I'm just here to help people find the resources that they need to sort of make it a little bit easier because it can be a lot, right? How do you sort through everything? All the conversations that you need to have. How do you start looking at your jealousy, boundaries, kind of all the common issues that arise from non-monogamy?
Yeah, it's a major challenge. But so let's talk about that.
Sure.
I love peer support. I went in undergrad. That's kind of where I started,
Mm-hmm.
like a therapeutic role. I don't know if
Oh,
that's
cool. Yeah.
I was interning at an organization that was really focused on peer support. And
Mm-hmm.
I was just obsessed with it. But so let's talk about some of the peer support that you provide. I want to know if I'm reaching out to you, if I'm a client of yours and I'm coming to you,
Mm-hmm.
what can I expect? What's your process like? What are the questions? What are the areas that you're focusing on, et cetera?
Yeah. So I let my clients, people really sort of lead the way.
Do you
I'm
call them clients?
tell
I mean,
It really depends. Again, it's one of those things. Some people are like, "Oh, you're my friend." I'm like, "Great. That if that's how you see me, that's fine, right?" I do sort of present myself as an anonymous friend. I think that helps kind of make the distinction between therapist and like peer support counselor, mentor, whatever. Um, because I do like we were just talking about, share a lot of my personal experiences, sort of some of the struggles that I've gone through where pertains, but it is a lot of whatever the person needs. So I do have certain calls where, this is something that I've been offering more recently. When someone is in a relationship and their partner is going out on a date for maybe the first time or one of like a new date and it's kind of stressful, sometimes I just sit and talk with the other person, right? So we can talk about, I've talked about TV shows, I've talked about like the L word with someone a couple weekends ago, and just like I'm that person who's there to distract you when your friends aren't available and when you're dealing with a lot, right? I think I talk a ton about jealousy and how to manage that. I think there's not a lot of good information about how normal it is to experience jealousy when we're talking about monogamy, right? There's this idea that jealousy is something that you do to other people, you cause it in other people, and therefore you're a bad person. And sort of starting to normalize what jealousy looks like and how to manage it, that's something that I talk to a bunch. And
yeah,
a
there's
lot
just
of
a
it,
lack of
yeah,
information in general about
yeah,
jealousy. Like,
absolutely.
it's a normal experience to
Yeah,
have in any type of relationship, like with a sibling, with a friend,
exactly.
with a, I don't know, hairstylist.
Yeah.
In terms of feeling jealous in the context of some kind of relationship, particularly monogamy, non-monogamy, an intimate, romantic, sexual relationship. It's huge.
Yeah, and just I think affirming to people like this does not make you a bad person. You're not a terrible person just because you're jealous. And you also can't force your jealousy to not exist, right? These are emotions, they come and they go. And I think what I do is really help talk people through their jealousy, right? So when someone is having an episode or just had one, we can talk about it. And sometimes just having another person to witness and listen, I'm impartial. I don't know any of the people who I talk to. And I think that can be both a challenge, but also a huge relief for people, right? I always start off my sessions telling people, like, I'm not here to judge you. It really doesn't matter. What you tell me has no impact on my life whatsoever. I'm not going to tell anyone. I don't know who you are. So if you want to tell me about how badly you reacted in this scenario, that's okay. I'm just here to listen to you. And we can talk about how to, either bring you back down to a state where you're not so emotionally flooded, or we can chat about the L word if that's what you need, right? I think different people
It's a
just
big
need
show.
really different things, and right, and maybe, and I think, yeah, sometimes like going to therapy is a lot for certain people, and I'm just like the first step between feeling like you have absolutely no support to what are your options and how do you move forward.
What do you think about people, the people that say I'm not a jealous person? Not, and it's not that I'm not asking this because I have any sort of value judgment. I'm just
Sure.
curious.
No, of course. It's actually kind of funny because you know, my domestic partner, I live with him, and we share sort of like all of our, domestic life, but we don't have a romantic or sexual relationship anymore. Although we tried, it didn't work out. And I think he's not a jealous person, at least not compared to me. And I think it's really important to be able to honor that fact. Like, just because someone is able to handle their emotions a little bit better, or someone doesn't externalize their internal experiences, doesn't mean that this is, like you said, better or worse. It's just that we're processing it differently. And I think what I do talk a lot about is how to have those conversations, right? If I am someone who does experience intense jealousy, how do I talk to my partners? How do I talk to my pals about that? Right? What do I need from them in order to come to an understanding, so that it's not just like, wow, she's acting really irrationally because I don't react this way, right? Being able to get to a point where we kind of understand how to navigate those episodes in a way that isn't hurtful to either of us.
I like that. Just the kind of it's a small distinction, but just in terms of the way that you put that some people, they're processing their emotions differently, that being jealousy.
Sure.
I think that what's implied there is it's not that they're not jealous, but it's just that it's
No.
as powerful in terms of the lived experience, that, as I know, I am a jealous person.
Right, me
And
too.
so it's not as powerful as people that might be like you or I, who will demand answers or however the jealousy comes out. But it's not
Sure.
that it's non-existent. Um,
Right.
just like,
Yeah,
someone was like, I'm not a sad person. It's not to say that they don't get sad, but
exactly.
they manage their sadness differently. I like the way that you put that.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that I talk a lot about is like discovering and really owning the way that your jealousy is triggered, but the way it manifests also, right? I think we, again, perhaps through our monogamous lens, tend to have one idea of the way that jealousy looks like, right? Tends to be very angry, tends to be very hostile, tends to be kind of controlling towards the other person. Some people just get really bummed out. There's fear, there's sadness, there's envy, like there's a whole cluster of ways that jealousy can present itself. And when we're not having those discussions, sometimes it can get confusing, right? Why does one person shut down and get really quiet and sad while the other person like flies off into a jealous rage, right? And I think starting to have
Or a
those
rage in response
conversations.
to the jealousy.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah.
Which I find interesting.
Having those conversations. Sorry.
So is jealousy, would you say, the most common thing that you discuss, or that people are coming to you to talk about? Or what are some of the other things that come up?
Yeah, I think jealousy is a big one. The other thing that we talk a lot about is boundaries. I think a lot of couples, and I've done this too when I was first starting out, I had this tendency to be like, oh, like I don't like the way I feel when I'm jealous. I'm going to put all of these restrictions on my partner of what she can and can't do. And starting to formalize boundaries that are a lot more focused on myself and what I can do, how I can behave in a way that is sustainable for everyone else's relationships. I think that is a pretty big distinction. And I do talk a lot to people about that. I think it can be overwhelming. A lot of people have a good idea of the necessity of having boundaries, but not necessarily understanding how you go about setting them, or how you can have boundaries that also give your partner the ability to explore and be their own individual.
Yeah, I think boundaries are huge. But I find that a lot of the content on Instagram sometimes can scare people about boundaries. I don't
Sure.
know if you feel that way, but like,
Yeah.
particularly the kind of stuff that says like, when you set boundaries, you're going to make people disappear from your life, or I don't know what
Yes.
the definition is.
Yeah.
And like, me, setting boundaries is a healthy thing to do in relationships. And oftentimes the more we're able to empower ourselves to set boundaries, the better responses we actually elicit in the relationships that we're in. Which I think is just a really important thing to underline, that oftentimes is not the narrative, at least on Instagram, that I'm seeing.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things I talk a lot about is that the positive boundaries that you have are just as important as the negative ones. It's not about just controlling and restricting what you can't do. A lot of it is about giving yourself the power to treat other people well. The first boundary I always set with any new partner, with any new pal, and when I'm doing peer support, I always suggest this, is I will treat you with kindness and respect, right? That's a boundary. That's a way that I can treat others. And I think people don't necessarily consider that to be a boundary, but I think having more of those positive ones makes boundary setting a lot less scary and way more supportive for the relationships that you want to have.
Yeah, so important. And so boundaries, jealousy. What are some other important things that come up?
I get a lot of couples that are looking to have threesomes. So I talk a lot about that. And usually one of the things that, again, I find really important is talking about the respect, right? I think there tends to be this idea that having threesomes really caters to the couple's fantasy. And, I'm not anti-threesome. I think some people believe that, and that's
Can you
not the
imagine if
case.
somebody was?
I
If that was
know.
like their platform?
It's not my
Against
platform.
threesomes.
I promise you, I'm not against threesomes. I'm against threesomes that make the third person feel excluded or feel fetishized and used, right?
Unless they want
So
to be used and fetishized.
sure, exactly. In which case, again, that's within the role of a fantasy, right? So I do talk a lot about how to have those conversations. How do you meet somebody and then are able to get to a place where you can have, scene negotiations so that everyone knows what's happening, so that it's not just about the couple's fantasy and the other person is getting, kind of pushed to the side. So I do talk a lot about that also. And I think, again, this just comes down to basic communication. I think we've seen so much sex in movies, on TV, etc., that's just so inarticulated, right? It's just this assumption that your clothes drop off in 2 seconds flat, and then everyone is orgasming within a couple of minutes, right? And I think the reality of sex is not that way. And especially when we're adding layers of complexity, you do need to talk about it. You do need to negotiate what is okay, what isn't okay. And when we're talking about threesomes, especially within established couples, there's different kinds of considerations that you're going to have. So just like empowering and educating people on that, and also sometimes just giving them the permission to say like, oh, it's okay for you to talk about this. Like, you're not expected to just go into these situations 100% comfortable, 100% knowing exactly what you're doing. It can be awkward, and you get to decide how you want to handle that situation beforehand.
That's interesting. It's interesting that threesomes are a big, I wouldn't have thought that.
Yeah, I think, again, it seems to be like a way,
Not because I don't think people are having threesomes. I just wouldn't.
No, sure.
It's like a major theme.
Yeah, I think there's the comfort, or I'm not entirely sure. I hear this a lot from specifically heterosexual couples, where they think that somehow it's going to manage their jealousy a little bit better if everyone is involved. Yeah, I think that's sort of the reason.
Say more. It's going to manage the jealousy if everyone's involved in the threesome, or what?
Yeah, exactly. Like, if the couple is both involved in the sex act, then somehow that's not going to trigger jealousy. I'm not sure if I completely agree with that, but it seems to be the thinking. Yeah.
With the third person. So like if they're all having sex at the same time?
Yeah, exactly. Like somehow then everyone knows what's happening and jealousy won't occur.
As opposed to somebody just watching?
No, I think as opposed to like going off and having like separate sexual experiences.
Okay.
Yeah.
You're saying as an alternative to hooking up with other people outside.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's why like it's a pretty common way for people to like first dip their toes into non-monogamy, I guess. Yeah, I hear a lot of, like I said, couples call me
together.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
What were you gonna say?
No, I was just curious to know if within your practice you find that there's a lot of similarities, like couples coming to you looking for advice on threesomes, or if this is something specific to peer support sessions.
They're not.
No.
I mean, most of the times when I'm seeing a couple, they're coming in because they're not having sex, whether they're open or closed. So the threesome is somewhat irrelevant to the lack of sex.
Right.
I mean, relevant in terms of they're not having sex, so inviting a third person is maybe going to stimulate some desire, but more so my focus just becomes on the two of them.
Yeah.
But I mean, I do see a lot of couples that are open or have some kind of poly structure, and they have we play with other people, we play with our what am I saying? We only play with, what am I trying? What did I say? I said it before. What is the phrase that people use? We only play together, whatever.
Yes.
Yeah, so they do that, and we talk about the threesomes that they're having. But it's usually not a presenting concern that I see. But I certainly do encourage threesomes. But yeah, I mean, especially in terms of talking about boundaries and jealousies. Can you pluralize jealousy?
In my experience, I experienced jealousies, so I'm going to go ahead and say yes.
Yeah, I mean, totally so important in threesomes. I'm having flashbacks as you're talking about that to my past relationship.
Right.
Just in terms of talking about, okay, what are the rules, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, when somebody else enters the picture, literally.
Yeah.
And yeah, I find though that a lot of the couples that I see when they're having threesomes, it really has this huge connective effect for them
Mm-hmm.
in terms of the primary partners.
Yeah.
That post threesome, they're able to feel closer to each other,
Mm-hmm.
of being able to express a part of themselves within the presence of their partner, that they weren't able to express with their partner, and then being able to return to the primary relationship with a newly developed self-expression that feels fun and new and interesting, etc. So I find that a lot, and
Mm-hmm.
processing some of that and processing what they were able to express with another person present that they weren't with their partner present, which I find pretty interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it comes back to this idea that everyone has different sexual preferences. When you're sleeping with one person for a long period of time, you kind of get into this routine, and it might become difficult to really introduce something new. So when you have another person there, inevitably, you're sort of forced to go out of your comfort zone. And I find that, like I said, this tends to be a way that couples feel more comfortable entering the realm of non-monogamy. At least certain people do. So it can be kind of like that first boost of confidence, like, okay, should we do this? Let's see how everyone feels, and then reevaluate if having other relationships outside of the primary one can even be an option.
Totally. Yeah.
Yeah.
I also see couples that they think about threesomes in terms of a solution,
Mm-hmm.
or even opening the relationship as a solution, which I think,
Yeah.
a solution to what? Um,
Right.
uh,
Yeah.
do you see that a lot?
Uh, yeah, I do. And I think, again, it's interesting because I have one voice on Instagram. I'm, like I said, a queer woman. So I think that presents a specific type of client also, or peer support people. Um, but I do have certain people who are coming to me who've been in really long-term relationships, and they've just kind of lost interest in it, and almost feel like having an outside relationship is the way that they can maintain sort of their domestic established life that they love, while still feeling like they can become their own individual and often sexual person, which I think works in certain cases, but I'm not sure how. I think one of the things, what I'm getting at really is that uh, in monogamy, you kind of learn to tiptoe around each other's problems, right? You kind of know what spots you don't want to poke at. And in non-monogamy, that kind of goes out the window, right? When you're adding a ton of different people into the relationship, the glaring issues, right? The communication breakdowns that happen that you can sort of manage when it's just the two of you, especially if you've been doing that for a long time, become glaringly obvious. And I think those problems can become even more pressing than people had thought. So I see it kind of either way, right? Either couples will learn to adjust and make the necessary changes to address sort of the shortcomings that exist in their relationship, or it might just end up blowing up their everything, right? And I've seen certain relationships, both in my personal life, but also here, where people just come back to me after a few months and they're like, yep, we can't do this anymore, which again is fair enough. Like it's not necessarily the easiest option if you want something that doesn't take a lot of maintenance or thought, right? Non-monogamy can take quite a bit of effort, especially emotionally, when you're starting off.
For sure. Yeah, I find it interesting that people, if they are in a monogamous relationship and it's a non-communicative relationship and
Mm-hmm.
they're disconnected to some extent, and then they open it, the relationship at times remains non-communicative and disconnected, until
Yeah.
there is, as you're saying, some kind of explosion where it's just unavoidable. So it's when people use non-monogamy as a solution to a lack or whatever experience is lacking in a relationship, it's just the same relationship, the same lack, until usually what happens is, you're saying, in a non-monogamous relationship, there's sometimes you just you can't avoid not talking about
Mm-hmm.
some of the issues that arise. So usually things do erupt, and the hope is that that the couple will use that as an opportunity to discuss some of the issues that were coming up when they were closed, because they were coming up when they were open too. And that's a lot of the things that I see. I see people that are
Yeah.
coming into me. A lot of them are cis gay men. They're coming into me, or I have a lot of straight couples as well. But they're coming into me and they just recently opened the relationship because they don't want to fuck each other.
Mm-hmm.
And the relationship that's open is the same thing. They have an open relationship where they don't want to fuck each other, or they have an open relationship that they're not communicating about. So a lot of that comes up as well. But the
Yeah.
communication is so important. Although
Yeah,
I do see
absolutely.
couples that come in and they're like not communicating about things and they report being happy. And
Mm.
I think that's just something to note, that especially in relationships, people
Mm-hmm.
always talk about how communication is the most important thing, which, I think it's very important, but there's also something to be said for the ways in which sometimes people just make it work.
Mm-hmm.
And, I don't know if that would work for me, but, I don't like mustard, so like that doesn't work for me. But some people just make it work. Some people have horrible communication skills, and nonetheless they are satisfied. So I like to, as I'm sure you do, really encourage communication, etc.
Mm-hmm.
But for some people, it's not an issue, which I
Yeah.
think should be studied more.
I totally agree. And I think, what you're saying is exactly that, is there is not one model that
No.
works for everyone across the board. If it works for people, then I don't see what the problem is necessarily. I think, like I said, when you're starting to include more and more people, the lack of communication then often becomes a problem, because just basic things like, how do you navigate like scheduling or physical space boundaries when no one is talking about anything? I don't know how it works, but like you said, I'm sure it happens. And I think fortunately or unfortunately, those aren't the couples that are coming to me necessarily, because a lot of the people who I talk to are really driven, trying to make this work, trying to figure it out, understand that there's always room for improvement, and that by enhancing their communication, they can sort of make this work in a little bit more coherent way, and sort of learn to be like better partners, but also better individuals. I think that that's one thing that I've definitely gained from my own non-monogamous practices, is like learning where my personal issues were, where I'm not clear in my communication, where I can do better, and where I have to force myself to grow and really examine the ways that I have certain patterns that don't work and that aren't sustainable for my other partners.
Yeah, relationships are a huge place
Yeah,
for personal growth and self-awareness and learning and all of that stuff.
absolutely. Yeah.
Um, Similar to, I think it's kind of like what we're already talking about. But the last question I have is, I always get asked this question, are you for or against monogamy? And I always laugh because it's like as if it were a religion or some kind of spirituality, or I don't know,
Right.
but I
Yeah.
think that relationships have kind of become politicized, especially for queer people. Um, and I'm just curious, how do you respond to that? I'm sure people
um
ask you.
they do. I think for me, I'm against compulsory monogamy. I'm
And say
against
more by what you mean by that.
Yeah, I'm against the idea that everybody has to be monogamous, that monogamy is the only way forward, that monogamy is the only right way, the only righteous way to exist. I think there is a lot of that enmeshed in religion and politics, like you said. But ultimately, like we keep on referring to, there's not one way that fits for everybody across the board. And anytime that we're trying to force all of humanity to fit one model, I think it's a big ask. And a lot of people just fall outside of that scope. And I think it is really important to be able to give everyone the power to define what kind of relationship structure they prefer and what works best for them. I think, we have the same thing with heterosexuality. A lot of us, myself included, were told that we had to be straight, and I tried to be straight for years as a result. And understanding that that does not work for people who are queer. You cannot force everyone into the same box. And in that way, I think it's the same thing with monogamy. You can't force people to choose one partner for life when that is not the way that they're necessarily wired, or the way that they're comfortable existing in the world and relating to other people. Yeah, does that sort of answer your question?
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
no, it doesn't. Yeah, of course. I mean, completely. But
Yeah.
it's really funny because people, I get that. I get asked that question a lot. And like I was saying, it's not as if it were a belief.
Right.
And
One thing that I find super funny, what really tickles me about this is that the people, because again, I get friends, family, strangers, the Jehovah's Witnesses who come and scream at me every week. Um, People have a lot of opinions about my relationships, about my sex life. That is part of the, I guess, part of the deal when you make it so public. But what I find so funny is that people who are the most vehemently opposed to my relationship tend to be people who are either serial monogamous, jump from one committed relationship to another, or are dating, on Tinder, sleeping with a lot of different people, or are cheating behind their partner's back. And in my head, it's funny that none of those things are considered non-monogamy to them.
I know.
The difference is just that we talk about it, and that we're trying to be respectful of other people's feelings and emotions. But ultimately, I think most people are, it's hard to find people who are just having sex with one person for their entire life. I think in 2019, I don't know if you encounter a lot of that, but I certainly don't.
Yeah, well, I mean, first, I think the question comes from a place of being confused and feeling confined,
Hmm.
and really not knowing what to do.
Yeah.
And I think the judgment comes from that place as well. But also religion, I think, is a big
Yes.
one.
Sure.
But in terms of, people um, nowadays in monogamous or non-monogamous relationships, I mean, I know both. The thing that I always like to point out is like, we have all of these ideas about how we want to live our lives, and then we kind of apply it to the rest of our lives and all the
Hmm.
relationships that we're ever going to participate in. And it's just kind of, I don't know, I think that's kind of bullshitty, because I don't know
Hmm.
what the fuck I want to do next week, let alone like
Right.
in my next relationship. And so like I can have ideas about how I personally want to, how I fantasize about my relationships and things like that. But until I'm like specifically experiencing one person or three people, I know that I'm not going to necessarily be able to predict what I'm going to desire in the context of that relationship. And so I think that, that question kind of jumps over all of that, that like
Yeah.
it operates under the assumption of like, what do you want for the rest of your life? Like, I'm like, oh my God, I don't know. I don't even know if I want to live in New York for any long, like,
Right.
like I think the idea that we need to commit to a belief, that being a relationship, that a relationship is a belief, is just it's so overwhelming. But I think that's what the question
Yeah.
is. People want some kind of solace or comfort in knowing how they're going to conduct the relationships, because whether people want to admit it or not, they're so central in our lives. So I don't know. My
Yeah.
response is kind of all of that, and then that's a bunch of bullshit in itself. But I think it's really important because most people are defining themselves or their pursuit of relationships or their experience in relationships by a lot of this kind of belief system.
Yeah.
And that's not something that's necessarily sustainable or that's going to last forever or that's even going to happen. At least people that aren't in relationships. Like I find it funny that people are
Hmm.
asking that questions about like and they're not in a relationship, and they're saying, no, I would never be in an open relationship. I would never be in
Right.
a monogamous relationship. It's like, but you're single. How do you, you're not even in a
Sure.
relationship. How do you know? So similar to what you're saying, I kind of do that. And then I really just say, it's not up to me to police people's relationships. Like, everybody's
Sure.
going to want a different experience in the relationship.
Yeah.
But I think, as you're saying, option, choice, freedom, independence, and deciding that in kind of a relational context with another person, because it's not just a one person decision, is really part of the answer to that question for people.
Right. And I think, a lot of practicing non-monogamy for me has been um, realizing that my parameters of what makes a successful or unsuccessful relationship needs to change, right? In monogamy, or in compulsory monogamy anyways, a lot of it is about longevity, right? You're trying to find the one for the rest of your life. And when relationships end, I think that's the one part that is challenging, at least for me, is coming to terms with the fact that these relationships tend to cycle a little bit quicker, right? I've seen quite a few people this year alone. Um, and that just because these relationships don't last, or just because one person cannot fulfill all of my needs, does not mean that they're unsuccessful, right? I've had really short, intense, and deeply meaningful relationships, but also the realization that it is a hard ask for some people to commit to non-monogamy long term, right? I've had just recently a relationship end because the woman I was seeing was like, I just can't. I don't have the emotional energy to see two people at once. And that's completely fair too. It does take more planning, more thinking, more talking about in general, trying to balance, the needs of multiple people instead of just one couple. And that can be a little bit draining. And I think I love that you're so open-minded, saying like, you can't predict your future. You can't just commit to the idea of monogamy forever. I think sometimes though, there's almost like solace in going back to monogamy, because you're like, okay, just one person. I don't need to extend all this consideration to multiple people and all of their needs on top of my own, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
totally. And I like what you said about relationships ending and not being a failure. I hear
Sure.
people say that so much, and it drives me crazy. My ex, when our relationship ended, it was talking about how our relationship was a failure. I'm like, we were together for like 10 years. It was like a
Yeah,
beautiful relationship. How
right.
is that a failure? But
Exactly.
people often view relationships as failures just because they end, and they're basing it on longevity, as you're saying. And
Right.
it's sad, because relationships are really beautiful and meaningful, and that they end sometimes, and it's a drama, and
Absolutely.
that doesn't make it a failure. It just makes it, they completed, they ended.
Yeah, and I think when we're talking about like theory about relationship structures and things like that, one of the things that I personally love about practicing non-monogamy or polyamory specifically is this idea that relationships have the ability to change and transform and morph. I've talked to you about my primary partner. We started going out in high school when we were 16 years
Oh my
old,
God.
and people were like, oh, you're a boy, you're a girl, you guys must be together, you must be dating. And we're like, yes, let's do that. And then coming out as queer in college, being like, wow, I do not want that anymore, like not in the romantic and sexual way, but this person is still the love of my life. He's the person who I count on to come home to, and who I will for the remaining future, for the foreseeable future anyways. But that doesn't necessarily mean that, again, our romantic relationship was a failure. It just did not work for us. And being able to get to a place where we understand that we do have the freedom to redefine it however we want. Right now, we are best friends who live together, and we're married because he has health insurance and I don't. So I think there's a lot of freedom in non-monogamy and polyamory to play around with what relationships look like and how people do relate to each other. And it doesn't have to be one way, and it doesn't have to be in every way. Also, we can have relationships that are just sexual. We can have relationships that are just platonically intimate. And, there's forever different types of arrangements that you can come up with.
Yeah, totally. I love that. Just in terms of what you're saying, is basically choice.
Yeah,
that we can all make
definitely.
informed decisions about the relationships that we want, that we don't need to feel confined by one model or another.
Yeah,
I love that.
I did too.
Okay. Well, we'll stop there. Thank you so
Perfect.
much for chatting. I love
Yeah,
the things you
absolutely.
said. Where should we direct people to find you? On Instagram? Is that the
Yes.
best place?
Yep, I'm on Shrimp Teeth and over at Easy Cauliflower Hour if you want to hear about my breakups. But otherwise, my website is also always active because you know how social media censorship is
It's wild.
wild.
It's
Exactly.
crazy.
It is
It's
truly.
nuts. I'm curious, how did you come up with the names? I mean, I
So
have theories, but I'd rather not assume.
oh, I would love to hear them first. Please tell
No,
me.
I'm not.
No? Okay. So I have a tattoo that says Easy Cauliflower Hour, and I got it with my partner and my best friend. We all have silly vegetable tattoos, so that
Yep.
was the first name. And then it means nothing. It
Okay.
just it was about like we wanted to go to the movies, couldn't find a movie that was playing, and then we ended up with those tattoos somehow. You know how it goes.
Yeah.
And then Shrimp Teeth, for a hot second, I don't remember. I think there was some drugs involved probably, but I pretended to be like a crustacean orthodontist to
Oh my
someone,
God.
right? They're like, what do you do for a living? And I was like, oh, I brush teeth of lobsters and
That would be
shrimps.
really impressive.
Yeah, so that was sort of how it came up. But you're right, a lot of people just assume it's some kind of dirty sexual innuendo. It's not, but
Yeah, I mean, I
I
was
like to
assuming that it
hear
was
that
just like
too.
another word
Yeah,
for vagina or vulva or something.
right. It
I was
could
like,
be.
I've
I
never
mean,
heard that one, but okay.
if
No, I
you want
figured it
it
was
to be,
something different.
sure.
That's
Yeah,
funny.
yeah.
Cute. Cool. Well, thanks,
It
Sam. I
was
really enjoyed this.
it was lovely
Appreciate
talking
everything you
with you.
shared. Again, everybody follow Sam at Shrimp Teeth and at Cauliflower Hour. And your website is cauliflowerhour.com, right?
It's shrimpteeth.com.
Oh, just kidding. Shrimpteeth.com.
Yeah.
Um, cool. Amazing. Well, thank you so much again.
It was lovely chatting with you too.
Thank you for trusting me with your valuable time and listening to this podcast. You can find everything we discussed today and more in the show notes. You can also find more information about our past guests on my website, toddsbarretts.com. Follow me on Instagram at YourDiagNonsense for more meaningful and fun content about the human curriculum. Thanks again for listening and check back for the next upcoming episode of Nonsense.